fate of the world is in his hands.
You can't help but to think, what would have it been like differently?
Here is the surprising story of America's secret weapon, a prolific spy who almost single-handedly pulled the world from the brink of nuclear war. In the early 1960s, US President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Union Secretary General Nikita Khrushchev berate one another in their public speeches. It's the height of the Cold War, and the world is ideologically torn in half. In the West, the liberal bloc led by the US. In the East, the Soviet bloc headed by the powerful USSR. Separated by an iron curtain, the two giants provoke each other with the threat of atomic weapons. Suddenly, in the heart of the Caribbean, a small Soviet enclave turns up the heat on the Cold War. Its name, Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy declares the immediate establishment of a naval blockade around the island to halt any new weapon deliveries. The news hits like a shockwave. Will the two world powers attack each other, triggering World War III? The key to averting nuclear war begins one summer night when strangers meet on the Moskvoretsky Bridge. A man enjoying the view, and two American interns, Eldon Ray Cox and Henry Lee Cobb, returning from the Bolshoi Ballet. The gentleman asks for a light, and then approaches them with a more unusual request.
He says, I have a package here. I want you to take it to a particular man. The man he identifies is the security officer at the American Embassy in Moscow. And I want you to take this package to him right away.
The man hands the students 2 envelopes. Then he disappears into the night. Originally written in Russian, they were translated into English by the US Embassy.
My dear sir, it is your good friend who is turning to you. A friend who has already become your soldier warrior for the ideal of a truly free world, to which your, and now my, president, government, and people are sacrificing so much effort. I ask that you believe the sincerity of my thoughts. At the present time, I have at my disposal very important materials on many subjects of exceptionally great interest and importance to your government.
The letters aren't signed. Who is this mystery man? And what does he really want? Enclosed with the letters is a single photograph. Still classified today, it gave the CIA a lead to pursue his identity.
When they open up the package in the American Embassy, they find a photograph of a man in a military uniform with the head cut off and an arrow that goes down and says, I am. And in there also is the photograph of an American military officer that had been a military attaché in Turkey.
He knows that by having that picture, we're going to be able to look back at the diplomatic record from the time. We'll be able to reach out to the Army colonel, and we'll be able to figure out who's in the picture. It was a good ploy on his part.
Colonel Oleg Penkovsky. During World War II, this brilliant Soviet officer rose through the ranks of the Red Army. In 1949, he enrolled in the Military Diplomatic Academy, where future agents are trained for the GRU, the Soviet Intelligence Agency. At just 30 years old, he is promoted to colonel Then after starting his career in Turkey, he becomes Deputy Director of Coordination for Scientific Research at the Soviet Committee. His mission? To gather technical knowledge from countries in the West.
On paper, he most certainly is a poster boy. He's an emblem of the Soviet regime. His rise, if you look at his resume, it's very consistent with many people in senior levels of military and intelligence. And in that effect, he's a kind of, a regular product. He's a shining example of the Soviet system. So the initial reaction of particularly the CIA is this guy's got to be a plant. He's got to be, in effect, feeding disinformation. He's working for the KGB or the GRU against us. It's too good to be true.
Despite the risk of a trap, the CIA sends an intelligence officer to Moscow to contact Oleg Penkovsky. If the man's motivations are honest, the West would have its first mole in the heart of Soviet power. An opportunity impossible to let slip by. In the spring of 1961, the meeting finally happens. The businessman and British MI6 contact Greville Wynne hosts a delegation of engineers and scientists in London. At the head of this small group is Oleg Penkovsky. At the Mount Royal Hotel, Greville Wynne informs the Soviet colonel he's expected in Suite 360 by Western officers. These hundreds of pages of transcribed conversations reveal specifics about the GRU, the heart of USSR intelligence. It's an organization that Penkovsky knows inside and out, because he's inside.
The technical documents he brought out were amazing, were great. He compromised over 300 KGB and GRU officers, names, photographs later on. That was wonderful. If we had never had another meeting with him after that first group, he still would have paid for himself. I mean, the amount of material he brought out was just staggering.
The Americans and the British are absolutely stunned about what they're hearing from him. He is the golden goose. He has a wealth of information and insight that they've never had before.
But as his time in London comes to an end, he must also wrap up his meetings in Suite 360.
At the end of the 52 hours, the four officers realized that they had a tremendous resource here. But they also had a resource who was soon going to go back into the most difficult handling environment you could face.
Immediately, it was decided that they needed to have a collection capability in Moscow so that they could pass information, receive information from him in Moscow. This is very, very dangerous to do because there's 7,000 people on the surveillance team of the KGB in Moscow alone. So it's very difficult to run a human source in Moscow. But the decision was they had to do it.
Back in the Soviet capital, despite the risks, Oleg Penkovsky continues working for his new Western allies. With his official passes, he can access the special collection at the Artillery High Command Library. This is where the regime keeps its most confidential documents about their military arsenal development. The CIA provided him with a Minox, a miniature camera, a tiny technological marvel. Penkovsky sends the microfilms to his contact, Greville Wynne, the organizer of the first meeting in London. The British industrialist often travels between the East and the West, so for MI6 and the CIA, he's the ideal go-between. Among the information delivered by Oleg Penkovsky, one topic will turn the tide of the Cold War. The US is convinced of Soviet superiority in what the leaders call the missile gap.
In 1960, before Kennedy, takes office, the United States is basically blind. It has no real understanding of Soviet military capacity, nuclear capacity. It doesn't know anything about systems, and it has this belief that Soviet missiles must be in the tens of thousands, that they are way further ahead than they actually are, and importantly, that they're further ahead of the United States. So this missile gap psychosis, I think you could call it, this conviction that a missile gap exists and the Russians are ahead of us, is what Kennedy assumes when he takes office.
Oleg Penkovsky suggests that the dreaded missile gap is an illusion. He claims the majority of the Soviet nuclear missiles aren't even operational. Nikita Khrushchev is just an extremely talented liar.
In such large questions of strategic rockets and attacks with strategic weapons, he lies and puts out what he wants as if it were true. Believe me, he lies like a gray stallion.
In the 1960s, there's a massive economic infrastructure behind the US military and its acquisition of more and more weapons. So nobody in that complex really likes to hear that Penkovsky has flipped the idea of the Soviet Union no longer being the number one, but the number two.
Because of this pushback, in June 1961, intelligence authorities decide to withhold Penkovsky's revelations from President Kennedy. Berlin is the only place on the globe where the two world superpowers stand face to face. One morning in the summer of 1961, the world wakes up astounded to discover a wall running 97 miles long and 13 feet high through the heart of Berlin. The German capital is literally cut in two. Friends, couples, entire families are separated by the wall. The outrageous move shocks the Allies. Considering the high risk of a Third World War, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, decides it's time to inform President Kennedy. On October 21, 1961, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense gives a public statement in Palm Springs, California. It was not filmed, but the text has been carefully preserved in CIA archives.
Berlin is the emergency at the moment because the Soviets have decided to make it so. We have called up 150,000 reservists, increased our draft calls. Our forces are so deployed and protected that a sneak attack could not effectively disarm us. We have a second strike capability, which is at least as extensive as what the Soviets can deliver by striking first.
The speech by the American Secretary of Defense in October 1961 is really a landmark occasion. It articulates the fact that the American position has changed, one from a conviction that they are behind the Soviet Union to the reality that they are in fact in the lead. And this is really one of the first times that the public, both American and international, is introduced to that idea.
The Americans officially announced that they no longer believe in the missile gap. On the Soviet side, it's a reality check. If the US no longer believes their lies, it's because someone has been feeding them intelligence. In the most watched-over city in the world, the vice slowly starts to tighten around Colonel Penkovsky. The Soviet Secret Service follows him everywhere he goes. They have his apartment under permanent surveillance and even search it when he's out in total secrecy.
how do they go into the apartment and do its security? I heard this from Yuri Nisenko, who was a second chief director of the KGB officer who actually was involved in the case. He defected to the United States, he's now dead, but he told me personally, he says, yeah, we put black medicine on his seat. So what's that? He says, we painted it on his seat. It absorbed in through his clothing, onto his butt, made him sick. And so we had to get him to go to the hospital. So when he's in the hospital, we can have free access into his apartment. When the KGB entered his apartment, they were able to find his camera that had been provided by the CIA. They were able to find the one-time pads that were used by him to encrypt communications to and from the CIA. So they were able to find that kind of tradecraft that only a spy organization would have.
The trap closes around the traitor colonel of the USSR.
He said famously in one of his debriefs he wanted to be the greatest spy in history.
Fortunately, Penkovsky had enough time to share thousands of pages of high-level intelligence with the West. Because, as his treason comes to light, one of the biggest crises of the Cold War is about to erupt in a small country of growing concern to the Western Bloc, Cuba. In 1959, the Caribbean island becomes a thorn in the side of the U.S. when Fidel Castro and Cuban guerrillas depose the pro-American dictator Batista. The new regime angers Washington by nationalizing American goods. And in 1960, as Castro and Khrushchev become allies, they cut off all diplomatic relations with the U.S. On October 14, 1962, an American reconnaissance airplane takes aerial photos of the island of Cuba. In one of the shots, there appears to be what looks like missile launch sites hidden in the jungle. In total secrecy, the USSR is arming the island with the blessing of Fidel Castro. In the days that follow, U.S. reconnaissance planes capture new photos over Cuba. Along with the launch sites, the Soviets brought several bombers and nearly 40 missiles that have a range of more than 930 miles.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Kennedy has to make a choice, and Curtis LeMay and all of these advisors are telling him to invade. They're saying, look, you have every reason now to invade Cuba. We should invade Cuba before these missiles become active and become true threats to the U.S. Kennedy argued that if we just suddenly invade Cuba, isn't that a lot like Pearl Harbor? How's the world going to look at us? Kennedy is looking for an option, some other way other than direct invasion.
When deliberating between strategies, President Kennedy relies on daily reports by the CIA. Many of them are stamped Ironbark, which indicates they are based on intelligence provided by Oleg Penkovsky.
There are now 22 surface-to-air missile sites located in Cuba, 9 of which are believed to be individually operational at the present time. The initial firing can take place any time after an alert. Refire from a single launcher will take approximately 3 to 5 minutes.
The nature of the missiles, their power, their range, their technical specifications. Because of Penkovsky, the American authorities can evaluate the extent of the threat.
It is a direct result of Penkovsky's information that allows the United States to know what the range of these missiles are, which is almost every part of the United States except Seattle. And he also knows how these operational missiles will come to be. In other words, how long it's going to take to make them operational. So it is Penkovsky's information that allows Kennedy to know how much time he has to negotiate the withdrawal of the missiles.
Kennedy knows he has, most estimates are between 3 and 8 days before the first set of missiles is going to be active. Now, down the road, he still had an option. If he tried to quarantine and we couldn't work things out, he could still go forward with the invasion.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The U.S. authorities draw a virtual line in the ocean and forbids any Russian ship to cross it. Violation would be considered an act of war.
President Kennedy's decision to implement a naval quarantine, is what he called it, in effect a naval blockade, is really a fairly unprecedented challenge, both to international law and particularly, given the context of Russian missiles coming into Cuba, basically drawing a line in the sea. The problem, of course, is that once you put it into place, you actually have to honor it. So the likelihood of a Russian vessel approaching that quarantine, that blockade, escalates the risk of war.
The entire world holds its breath. But a diplomatic solution is still possible, mostly thanks to Penkovsky.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you, and good night.
As Kennedy delivers his famous speech, the spy Oleg Penkovsky is arrested by the KGB in Moscow. The Americans have just lost their greatest ally, but they don't know it yet. 2 days later, on October 24th, at Khrushchev's order, 12 boats turn back. The rest stop in their tracks. The tension reaches a peak. This line drawn around Cuba represents the final border before a thermonuclear war. On October 26th, the Soviet leaders asked to negotiate behind closed doors.
They wanted to set up a back-channel communications with the United States to find out if we could negotiate a way to save face, that we'll pull away, but you've got to give us something. So they activated a KGB resident in Washington, D.C., Alexander Feklisov. And they set up a back channel that they can exchange information without the public knowing about it. And we basically say, we will stop the blockade if you'll pull your missiles out. You're just going to stop your armada, you're going to turn around, you're going to take them back. And then quietly, we'll take our weapons out of Turkey.
The confrontation continues, and each side holds its position. Everyone is on alert, ready to act at the slightest aggression. Finally, on October 28th, the USSR withdraws its ships and promises to dismantle all facilities in Cuba. In exchange, the Americans agree not to attack the island, and secretly, Kennedy also promises to dismantle 15 nuclear warhead missiles based in Turkey, Italy, and Great Britain. The crisis is over, and the world takes a breath. But the one truly defeated in this story is without a doubt Oleg Penkovsky. In May 1963, Penkovsky was tried in a tremendous show trial. At the end of the hearing, the spy is sentenced to death and executed on May 16, 1963. This brilliant Soviet officer gave his life for a cause he defended. In just 18 months, he rattled powerful USSR and radically changed the balance of power between the East and the West. Experts are unanimous. Oleg Penkovsky played a crucial role in resolving the most dire crisis of the Cold War.
What Penkovsky did was allow the Americans at the most critical moment in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis, to have an understanding they previously didn't have. So what that means is that you're not far off if you say Penkovsky helped avoid a thermonuclear war.
He paid the ultimate price. But the ambitious Colonel Oleg Penkovsky achieved his goal, becoming one of the greatest spies in history. The one who helped save the world from nuclear war.
This guy was at the right place at the right time and had the right motivation to give us lots of very important information, actually in a very short period of time. Having taught espionage my whole professional life, I know of no human source who is more important than Oleg Penkovsky.
He has to be considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest spy of all time, for all that he contributed.